you everyone for joining the panel today, which is on valuing diversity and building bridges. My name is Dee Corrigan and I lead the corporate engagement here at Blueprint. I'm delighted today to be joined by three panelists: Samuel Okafor, who's Executive Director at Coutts, but has also been the co-lead on the Racial Equality Task Force at NatWest. We've got Alison Taylor joining us from the US, where Alison is Executive Director at Ethical Systems, which is part of NYU Stern School of Business. And finally, but certainly not least, we've got Nick Dalton, who is consultant, but was formerly EVP at HR at Unilever and has recently written a book on Change the Workplace, Change the World. And he'll be talking a little bit about some of the insights, both from his time at Unilever and also what he's drawn in that book. So over the past year, we've seen a vital and in many ways long overdue push for transformational action to address issues of discrimination and systemic inequality in our organizations. But this push is paralleled with what I sense a deepening division on the views of the role of business in society. We've convened this panel today to explore what role business can play and what types of conversations, debates, and actions are needed now, and how to build bridges rather than sow seeds of division. Before we dive into the conversation, just a little bit of brief housekeeping before we launch in. The webinar is being recorded. And that will be shared with you after the event. We're planning to open up the discussion for audience questions in the last 5 to 10 minutes of today's session. If you would like to ask a question, please do submit it via the Q&A facility on the Zoom app. So that's a Q&A facility, not the messaging function. And please just submit your questions as the discussion happens. Unfortunately, we'll only be able to call on a few of you, but when I do, Amelia and Sula, who are the team here helping me behind the scenes, will unmute you and you'll be asked to ask your question live. So I think that's it from a housekeeping perspective. So just to help frame today's discussions, I'd love each of the panelists to respond to the question: why do you do the work that you do, and what change are you hoping to see in the world or in your organization through that work? So I'm going to call on Samuel first.
Yeah, thanks, Dee, and thanks for having us being part of today's conversation. So I guess for me, I'm really passionate about building an inclusive culture for our colleagues, our customers, and our communities, a culture where actually people can thrive. A culture where people can bring the very best of themselves and achieve their full potential. Sadly, I know that today people still face many barriers, and our colleagues, customers, and communities still face barriers that stop them from actually fulfilling their full potential. So I'm really motivated and passionate about breaking down those barriers and playing a significant part, a small part or a big part, in terms of what we can do to be able to break down the barriers and to really champion the potentials that enable people to thrive. What I hope to see is greater representation at senior levels of our organisation. I hope to see that our customers and our colleagues and our communities thriving and doing well, whether that's our colleagues reaching their full potentials, whether that's customers owning their own businesses and doing really, really well, and whether that's communities that are thriving. So that's what I hope to see. Thanks, Dee.
Thanks, Manny, Samuel. Nick, why do you do what you do? What change are you hoping to see?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because it made me think back to when I actually started in HR, when it was called personnel then, in the mid-80s. And honestly, I joined HR because I wanted to do negotiations. I had this sort of really quite immature power image of being this, hard-nosed negotiator. And that's why I did it to start with. And it was a trade union official one evening, because it was very old-fashioned culture, and we were having a pint in the pub after a negotiation. And he turned around to me and he said, if you change the workplace, you can change the world. And this guy probably to this day doesn't realize how profound that was for me, because I thought, well, yeah, the world spends most of its time in work. If we can get the world of work right, and to what Samuel said, if we can build a world of work that's really about enabling people to realize their potential and purpose as human beings, my God, that really does change the world. And it changes the world in a way that some of the, political posturing and other things just doesn't get there. So the reason I spent 35 years in HR was because you could make those little differences that made a big difference to people's lives, bit by bit by bit by bit. And the more HR people there are who make those positive interventions, the more we can create a system that can change the world for the better. So yeah, that's why I do what I do, and I'm glad I had that pint with that trade unionist some way back in the late 1980s.
Great, thank you very much, Nick, and definitely looking forward to hearing about some of these little differences that can add up to making a big difference. Alison, why do you do what you do?
God, it's a great question. I've had time to think about it now, and I still haven't come up with a perfect answer, but I suppose in my current iteration, I think of myself as a translator. So at the moment, what I'm trying to do is bring the best ideas from academia into the private sector. But more broadly, I see a lot of very siloed thinking and good ideas in one domain that aren't being applied in another, and a lot of very simplistic binaries. So I'm really just trying to share the best ideas, I suppose, with the ultimate goal, the same as Nick and Sam, to build more human organizations that will be better for the planet and society and the businesses themselves. So I'm excited by societal change. I'm excited by capturing what I see going on in society and in the classroom and using that to build better businesses. But it's been a feature of my career that I've jumped around a lot, and so to the degree I can do anything, I think it's connecting the dots between disparate thoughts and ideas.
Great, thank you. Very much needed as well, I think, because lots of thoughts, probably not enough connection happening. Fantastic. And I will ask just in a moment a little bit more about all of your individual experiences, but the topic of today's webinar is valuing diversity and building bridges. And I just wondered, what does it mean for each of you to value diversity, and why does that matter? Nick, I'm going to start with you this time.
As Alison just said, I think where we are in the world today is where we're really dealing with a lot of complex or wicked problems. The levels of complexity we're seeing now are beyond levels of complexity we've had to deal with before. And I think unless we value diversity in its broadest sense, we are not going to find ways through managing this complexity. I think diversity is such a fundamental capability. It's such a fundamental mindset to connect the dots in a way we've got to connect dots that haven't been connected before, to ensure that we are using the talents and the ability of all of us in all the different ways we manifest our talents and abilities and differences, because we're not going to solve today's complexity with yesterday's simplicities. So I think diversity and inclusion is such a fundamental capability that we've got to develop.
Great, thank you. Alison.
So, I mean, when I think about diversity and inclusion as a topic, this has been one of the few areas in the world that I've seen massive, dramatic, positive change during the course of my career. You can think about marriage rights and now being allowed to marry and love who you want in most countries. I see profoundly different thinking around this topic in the classroom and among young people. I fully agree with everything that Nick said, that we will not be able to transform organizations using the same leadership and the same approach and the same thinking that have got us here. So I think diversity is one of the tools that we can use to advance positive change. And then I'm deeply frustrated by the conversation that is still taking place about, is there a business case for diversity? Is there any value to this? Why are we doing this? Can we prove it makes more profit? I think that is a conversation for the 20th century. Nobody that I talk to under the age of 35 thinks that's an interesting conversation. I think we need to get on and figure out how to do this and how to make it more effective, and stop making this case from a position of weakness, but actually try and really explore in an evidential way what works and make that happen. I don't think we've got more time to waste here. So I guess that's my starting point.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really interesting because I think depending on who you ask that question of, like, how do you value diversity? So many people jump to financial value and the business case when you frame that, right? So I think that's also part of the broader problem that we have around what we value and how we value things. Samuel, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. So I totally agree with what Nick and Alison said. So I think valuing diversity is significantly important. And when we value diversity, we create an environment where people can thrive, where people can bring the very best of themselves into the workplace, and also has really good positive impact on people's well-being, as well as their sense of belonging, which is really, really important. When we value diversity, we know that we learn and we grow as we learn from people's different perspectives and also people's backgrounds. When we value diversity, we have teams that are more creative and innovative, and we design better products and services to meet the diverse customers that we have as well. So for all those reasons, diversity is fundamentally really important for businesses and also for us as individuals.
Great, thanks. And Sam, so you work with Coutts, and Coutts, of course, is part of the NatWest group, and we've been working with NatWest or alongside NatWest for a number of years now on your journey to becoming purpose-led. Last year in 2020, NatWest launched a report on racial equality for customers, colleagues, and communities, which included 10 commitments. And I know you were one of the co-leads on that task force, which was an employee-led task force. And only yesterday you launched the update on, I guess, how you're tracking against some of those commitments. I'd love to, I guess, hear more broadly your insights on that task force, what it meant to lead that task force, but also some of your own personal learnings over the last year in leading that piece of work at NatWest.
Yeah, it's great. So last year, following the Black Lives Matter movement, Alison Rose, the group CEO, asked myself, two of my colleagues, Shan Begum and Yinka Fadner, to co-lead the Racial Equality Task Force. And we were really keen not to come out and rush out with a set of commitments or targets and so on. So we took our time to be thoughtful, to be balanced, to really get the organisation to talk about race, something that most organisations don't want to talk about, most leaders don't want to talk about. And we got the group to talk, to listen, to understand the lived experiences that are faced by our colleagues. And some of those stories that leaders had to hear were really uncomfortable, and some of them were hearing it for the first time. But we took our time to be thoughtful and to listen, and we did that for a number of months. And having done that, we set out 10 commitments in October last year, which were focused on what we could do as an organisation to champion the potential of our colleagues, customers and communities, to break down the barriers that sadly still exist today in society. And we published that in October last year, alongside a new Black target of 3% of our senior leaders in the UK by 2025, because we recognise that actually, of the ethnic groups, actually our Black representation was the lowest. So we put a target to address that. We published an updated report in April, an interim report, to see how we're progressing against those. And more recently, yesterday, we launched our 1 year on report, which is great. And for me, what this shows is that we've got really good momentum against the targets and the commitments that we set ourselves out, which is really, really positive. I guess for me, what the learning that's taken through the journey is that cultural change does take time. And I also recognise there is this impatience to move things a lot quicker as well, from myself and from colleagues and from so many people that you speak to as well. But the reality from what I've experienced, what my colleagues have experienced, is that actually that cultural change does take time. And there is that need to bring leaders and bring colleagues on a journey with you as well, which can sometimes be a real challenge as well. I think the other learning I've taken away from it is the importance of working with our employee-led network. So we've got a network on LGBT, we've got a network on gender and disability and many others, and really seeing the challenges that they face as well. So I think it's been a really interesting journey. It's been a challenging journey, but an enjoyable journey. But it's great to see that we've got the momentum going. And yesterday's report really does highlight the progress that we're making, albeit we also want to go further and faster.
Absolutely. And I know one of the really interesting things is, I guess, the strength of your employee networks. and also the fact that those employee networks are brought together on a regular basis. Is that correct? Like how does that kind of interconnection work between the different employee networks, and what's the implication for that?
I think it's great that, first of all, we've got a CEO who champions and is a sponsor of the employee-led networks. We've got circa 20,000 colleagues that are signed up to the network as well, really championing inclusion and understanding the barriers that we face individually, but also collectively as well, and working together to really understand what we can do as an organisation to really break down the barriers and to help colleagues to thrive as well. So that working together across the ELNs is really, really powerful, whether that's putting on events, putting on learning materials, helping the group to be more inclusive. And I think the employee-led network plays a significant part. But I think it's great that we have a CEO who sponsors that and has the chairs meet regularly as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And Nick, you worked at Unilever for 34 years. And I guess just picking up on what Samuel said there about culture change, can take time. So you kind of have the impatience element of it, and that's important. What's your sense of, I guess, what was a change that you witnessed over your time at Unilever?
Yeah, I think if I reflect on it, I saw four different waves of sort of change, which didn't actually only apply to diversity and inclusion, but it was inherent in the way the business looked at itself. So when I joined in the mid-80s, I was a personnel manager, and actually it was all about process. And the way we thought about diversity and inclusion, we didn't use that term, of course. It was equal opportunities or sex equality, and we followed the law. Now, even in the mid-80s, actually following the law was a major exercise, because it wasn't a given that these laws were actually fully implemented, and the requirements of the law meant there was work to be done. And so in my early days, that's what I would do. I would look at the legislation, look at the best practice from ACAS or wherever it would come from, and ensure we were implementing it. Then the second wave, I call it the profit wave, was really into the 2000s. It was when that era of process has sort of become deemed to be too slow. Suddenly my job title at that point changed from being a personnel manager to an HR manager. Now, I just thought that was a more American, snazzy, fashionable job title, so I was all for it. It was only later on I realised that was profoundly ideological, because actually we'd gone from an age of process to an age of profit. And not only were we changing the names of the job titles, but we were also starting to individualise reward, give share options, give bumper bonuses, and change the whole way we did a load of stuff to individualise it. But that was when actually diversity first came on the agenda. And it really arrived, particularly in the developed world, actually, as part of this war for talent, which was quite big at the time. Why are you ignoring half the population? And so this was where, to Alison's point, the business case for diversity became a thing we would work on, because clearly there was a business case because of the war for talent. And so, and you still hear business leaders today, actually, who are still in this profit wave of mindset, talk about the business case for diversity. And we did that. We did that for about 5 or 10 years. Did we actually increase gender diversity? Because that was mainly the focus, because it was driven by the war for talent. Not really. We got to 35% females in our sort of management cadre, and it sort of stopped then. Then we had a new CEO join, and he took us to another wave, which was really the purpose wave, and took the business back to saying, what was the root problems the business was trying to solve for, and what was the purpose of the business around cleanliness, around sustainability, and actually around using our brands to make the world a better place. And then this wave actually saw us take diversity and inclusion because it was the right thing to do. So no longer did we have to do a business case, but it was the right thing to do. And inclusion became something we spoke about. This was the era of people and purpose. And a lot of companies are just starting this wave, I think. And we did a lot of work then, not only in terms of gender diversity, but we broadened the agenda to include LGBT plus and disability or disability, and started to really work on trying to have a workforce that reflected our consumers, and actually applying similar thinking to the developing world too, where women were terribly exploited in our factories in part-time and precarious jobs. And during this era, because we actually put quotas in, so it wasn't all soft stuff, there were quotas put in, because it's the right thing to do, you start to target people. And we got to 50% female representation in our management group. But we still had lots of work to do in the developing world, particularly with women in factories and low-paid jobs. So we started to think about that, but we also detected a backlash, because you start to get a backlash. You start to get a backlash from the men. Never explicitly said, it's always in the corridor. You start to get a backlash, particularly in parts of the world around the LGBT plus developments. And that backlash is dangerous because it could lead to aggressions. Now, in Unilever, just as I was leaving, actually, that backlash was being taken head on. So we had the CEO in global town halls, directly addressing issues around Black Lives Matter, directly addressing issues around LGBT rights in the Middle East, and directly addressing Unilever's own record in having a product called Fair and Lovely in India. So he began to face into the paradoxes, which is the last wave, the latest wave. The paradoxes are actually, this is complex. You don't just solve these problems. What you do is you work the polarities of these problems. You join the dots. And this is where actually you suddenly get the insight that diversity and inclusion is just one of your capabilities that helps you join the dots and solve for complexity. Because unless you're prepared to face into polarities and paradoxes and accept there are issues, but you need to work them, you need to transcend them, you'll never solve them. So long answer, but I've seen those four waves: the sort of process legal wave, the profit business case wave, the people and purpose, it's the right thing to do wave, and then a breakthrough, which I don't think Unilever haven't got there yet, and most companies haven't got there yet, but I think is potential now to be born, of the paradox wave, where actually it's really integrated into our problem solving and human ability to solve problems for ourselves.
Yeah, fantastic, Nick. I think your thinking around this area of paradoxes is so important in the next steps, in particular in our work at Blueprint and our engagement with businesses. Alison, I'd love to hear, I guess, your thoughts on how Nick just talked about the evolution at Unilever, and is that something that you recognize from your experience, your very vast experience across different roles, and also where you think maybe broadly the US might be? Hard to, of course, label all of the US businesses together, but yeah, a sense of where you think things are at in the US.
I absolutely love Nick's frame, and I love where he ended on paradoxes. I'm trying to write a book at the moment on the evolution of business ethics, and one of the ways I start chapter 1 is saying that we are now in this situation of layers of paradox. So Nick, it's like you read my mind. So what I work on is ethics, or what Nick just called the right thing to do, which is I think a better way to describe it. And my thesis is that what we name as business ethics is in fact a very complex and robust set of defense mechanisms to protect for private sector organizations from regulatory or reputational risk, or both. So we can think about compliance as a mechanism to protect the company from legal risk, usually by dumping blame on bad apples internally to save the organization. And then we can think about ESG and sustainability, or whatever people want to call it today, as having been treated until quite recently as essentially the paramilitary wing of the marketing department. So this is about controlling the company's reputation and controlling the narrative. This was very easy in the 20th century, cozy relationships with the mainstream media. You have a PR team, you have very aggressive NDAs and non-disclosure agreements, very hot topic in the US at the moment. And you can, to a great extent, control what is being said about you externally. That has collapsed for various reasons. We can see the rise of transparency, social media use, companies being forced into a much more interactive relationship with their customers, with their suppliers, with the general public. We can see the exponential rise of leaking and whistleblowing, usually using the mainstream media and Twitter. We can think about what's going on at Facebook in the last couple of days. That is a failure of internal speaking up, that this person has now gone to the media and gone to the Senate, and this is completely blowing up. there's the business case right there for inclusion and diversity and listening. Not that I think the business case is the right way to go. We're in an era of popular protest. People are incredibly frustrated by their governments. They are turning to business because there's nowhere to go. Business is, to a very great extent, better placed to solve these problems than many, many national governments. We've seen, I think, or we're seeing the beginning of an enormous reckoning about power and inclusion and opportunity inside organizations, visible manifestations of which are Me Too and Black Lives Matter. But I think this is about hierarchy. I think this is about young people wanting to be led and managed very differently. We can no longer have the view that leadership is you set direction from the top down, you incentivize your people to perform, you sit back and let the profits roll in. You need to have a much more interactive relationship with your employees who want to be coached and managed and led in a very different way. And then very, very different that I've mentioned before, values from young people in society. So all of these things I think have dissolved the boundaries between organizations and the outside world, which were always artificial, but that's clearly the Milton Friedman framework, right? That there is a clear division between the company's interests and externalities, and we rely on the government. So we're in this situation where that paradigm has dissolved. We're all anti-Friedman. There's an anti-Milton Friedman reckoning going on, but those shareholder pressures still exist. So that paradigm's collapsed. We don't have a new paradigm, and so a company that wants to do the right thing is in this incredible paradoxical situation where those pressures haven't gone away and there are new pressures coming up. I don't think we can solve all of them with a win-win business case about how this will all make more profit. I think we do need to think about ethics and values and integrity as a strategic advantage. And for reasons I hope are obvious, I've gone on too long already, diversity and inclusion is a key part of this conversation. But what I think we're in the middle of is this comprehensive reckoning of the role that we expect business to play in society, and also expectations that young people have about their careers. So that's the way I would look at this. I think that Europe is more advanced on questions of ESG and sustainability in general. Diversity and inclusion has a very specific character to do with the US's history, but as we can see, when the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. This Black Lives Matter movement originated in the US and is having a huge global impact. But I think one of the challenges that people have that are trying to navigate this is that the racial dynamics in particular, as they play out in the US, don't necessarily resonate in other countries. So I think where organizations really need to get is being pluralistic about their values, which doesn't mean you don't have any values, but managing these risks of kind of hypocrisy and defensiveness are really top of mind.
Great. Thank you. And I'm keen to just pick up on something that Nick said around the potential for regression right now. I guess that's a concern I have. And I guess there's those who say that companies taking, for example, a stand on a social issue or talking about race in the workplace, that's politics, there's no place for that in the work environment. And I think we've seen potentially some more extreme examples of this in the US, Alison. So I'd love to just get your thoughts on, is there a genuine concern that we might regress, or is this just part of the process that we go through to step forward?
I mean, I think the context of polarization around these issues is pretty concerning. I think the framing of diversity and inclusion issues as political is really problematic. They're political versus personal, depending on who you are and your social identity. I think a lot of the reasons for any potential backlash on diversity and inclusion in particular are, one, this need to prove quantifiable evidence around profitability, which I think just gets us trapped into a conversation where we're trying to make a case for something that should be obvious. I think something that has also historically been the case is that women and people of colour are expected to carry the burden of these initiatives. They're very often, pressure is put on them to lead these task forces and inclusion roles and this kind of thing. That is a lot of emotional labour a lot of the time. Other people in the organisation view that that naturally as self-serving. And so I get very concerned, one, about conversations kind of denigrating white people and particularly white men and saying they can't contribute and can't help in this conversation because those people are still in power and we need their voices and we need their support, not just dumping all of this on women and people of color to kind of drive this change. I am, by the way, very encouraged to read papers in my class from students who, and often they're young white men, not always, but who are very conscious that they need to defend their female colleagues when there are instances of sexual harassment and they need to kind of take on some of this themselves. So I think there is a certain amount of backlash around polarization that we can get into a little bit further. I think the rather oppositional framing around kind of social identity and interest groups can be problematic, but at the same time there are very egregious historical injustices to correct. So I think the focus needs to be on inclusion. I think we need to draw a bigger circle. I think we need to do everything possible not to aggravate senses of defensive-ness. And I think we need to encourage people to join this conversation without getting concerned that if they say the wrong thing or they use the wrong term, that they're going to be cancelled or criticised in some way. So a long way to go, but the thing that gives me the most hope is that I don't see this backlash in younger generations. I don't see this case. I don't think that anybody under the age of 25 is particularly kind of interested in the debate. They're interested in actually making this happen.
Thanks, Alison. Samuel, I'd love to hear about your experience actually in this area in terms of the conversations that you've been having over the last 12 months and more around this, and whether you sense there's any potential backlash and how do you deal with that in your role?
Look, I think there's been, over the last 12 months, I mentioned to you, there's been quite a lot of conversations around race and listening to colleagues' lived experiences, and many of those experiences are uncomfortable. I think for the first time, the movement we had in the last 12 months, it just felt like colleagues are more open to share their lived experiences, and some of the experiences that happen in work, but also some of the experiences that happen outside of work as well. I've seen over the last 12 months leaders stepping into it and being more comfortable with sharing, with being able to listen and step into those conversations, which I don't think actually 12 months ago they would have been comfortable in being able to lead those conversations. So I think for me that's been really positive. I've been really encouraged by the fact that actually we've not just only listen to the conversations, but we're taking positive actions off the back of those conversations as well. I also think our allyship program has been really great. So to Alison's point, we need allies. If we're going to see the change that we want to see, we need allies, and we need white allies. We need white male allies as well. And we've got an allyship program with over 2,000 colleagues that have signed up to it, championing racial equality, making a difference, gaining their awareness, being positive, taking positive actions to change it. It's not just the commitments at the top that changes the organisation, it's what people do on the ground that changes the organisation, which is really important. So yes, you can have a board, you can have an execs that are signed up to diversity and inclusion, but fundamentally this has got to be embedded right the way through the organisation. And this is about every colleague, knowing what they can do to be allies and really support support us on our journey.
Thanks, Samuel. Nick, I can't remember if this was a point I drew out from your book or maybe more broadly from our conversation that we had, but I guess there's a tendency when things can become more polarized for us to look for a more strong directive type leadership, when in many ways, I guess, and hearing from Samuel there about the change in the leadership capabilities over the last 12 months at NatWest. But I guess in many ways, actually, what we really need is more collaborative leaders, or leaders, I guess, to your point, that can actually hold these paradoxes and the complexity. What's your thoughts, I guess, coming from the HR world in terms of the leadership capability that we now need?
Yeah, look, I call people the Nelson Mandelas of the business world that we need. And that's a very high bar. And we're in a race against time, actually, to grow leaders who can do that versus the type of paradoxes that could cause regressions. Alison mentioned the companies do need to deliver numbers. And if a company does get involved in a stance around diversity and inclusion or wider sort of quotes, small c political stance, and work is political. The political parties in the UK and Europe all come from the workplace. You know, Labour, Conservative. Well, actually, that's a work thing. Labour is for work. So work is political. And companies can get now embroiled in the politics. And then if the numbers aren't coming in that quarter, then there's real problems. And as Samuel mentioned, being an ally, you know, and I'm very conscious, you know, when you asked me, Dee, to join this panel, you know, does a white middle class man join a panel on diversity and inclusion, really? You know, what should I be here? And being an ally is really difficult because in the type of circles I mix in, and I mix in all sorts of circles from football grounds to golf clubs to all sorts, you know, that regression is there. Yeah, you can't say anything nowadays, can you? You know, it's there. We all know it. It's there. And to be an ally, I can't just smile and let it go. To be an ally, I've got to address it. But how do you address it? Because if I address it in the way my own sort of conditioning would address it, I'll just make it worse because I'll just have an argument. And actually doesn't do anything. So the level of leadership, the level of influencing, the level of sophistication I have to be able to be an ally and address that in a way that's actually going to transcend it and move it on, blimey, that's tough. And I'm not capable of doing that. I'm working towards it, but I'm not capable of doing that. But when you see leaders who do it, and there are some leaders now in industry who are doing it, and, you know, I worked there for 34 years. I love the company, but I wouldn't say if it wasn't true. Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever, is doing it in his town halls. And he is having influence by really responding to these things in a way that is, he's not a Nelson Mandela, but is that level of leadership, that doesn't seek to identify trade-offs, but seeks to identify polarities and transcend them. It's systems thinking, it's the emotional maturity, it's the mindfulness. It's bringing all that to bear on this agenda. So it's going to be really hard, but that's the work.
Any tips on how to deal with that kind of comment in the football field or in the corridors of the workplace? Honestly,
I could do with the tips, so I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say. No, genuinely.
I know, I'm with you.
You face it all the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes I end up in a blazing row with people, and sometimes I just bottle it and don't just let it go. And that's not being an ally. But if you're going to be an ally, you've got to be an ally in a way that moves the agenda forward, not one that consolidates the conflict. So I'd love to hear from this group. It's one of the things I'd like to learn actually in this discussion. So don't ask me that question. Ask others so I can learn it.
Great. Well, I mean, we'd love to hear from Samuel and then maybe Alison on that. And if anyone has thoughts on that question, please put it into the chat as well. Samuel.
So Dee, I mean, the great thing about our allyship program is that we have run sessions throughout the last 12 months to equip allies to one, be advocates of change and to also to raise their awareness, but to also give them the tools that enables them to be able to challenge non-inclusive behaviours. And there's different techniques. There is the direct approach where you just have to, deal with things head on. There is the approach where you can actually have a conversation with someone outside, the meeting. They've said something that wasn't very inclusive, and you take them to the side, you have the conversation. Lots of different tools and methods that you can use to address it, and also address sometimes when a leader gets it wrong as well. So our allyship program, for me, has been a real key success over the last 12 months in just giving people those small nuggets of tools that enables people to grow in confidence and to challenge non-inclusive behaviours. Nick, I don't know if that's helped at all.
And Samuel, actually, one of your own colleagues at NatWest, Alex Chesterfield, has just co-written this book on Poles Apart, and it was through her introduction that we now know of Alison Taylor. So yeah, I mean, I'm only at the start of reading this, but it really gives you a better understanding of why we polarize, why we group think, and we all do it. So I'm hoping by the end of the book, I'll have a little bit more tips on how to, and be able to hopefully put it into practice myself. Alison, any thoughts on the question?
Well, reading Poles Apart is really good advice. A sister organisation to Ethical Systems called Open Mind Platform, that's Open Mind Platform, either .com or .org, has training that allows us to manage polarisation and be more open-minded. They've been very, very successful in both universities and the private sector. I suppose if it's not too simplistic, what I would say is that I believe a fundamental criteria of career success ought to be your ability to work with and manage people that have profoundly different personal values from you, and that you might even personally dislike. I think that ought to be a criteria for success. I think you ought to be able to navigate and manage these dynamics in your team and build inclusion and not hire for cultural fit, and that working across these systems and across these social identities and across these values differences, and having that confidence and having that capacity to manage, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's racism, whether it's speaking up. Essentially this is about building psychological safety and allowing people to bring their personal values to work, but maybe not expect that their personal values will align with the organizational values in all cases. So all of that is extremely difficult. We do not necessarily train or prepare leaders to do this. It's more about politics and how you sell. I think there's a broad transformation going on in the workplace that will serve this eventually. But something else I think that works is having different sorts of leaders at the top, because then it's much easier to drive change down. So I don't think the focus on boards and senior leadership teams is misdirected. And I think if we do have more, Black and women leaders in those roles, that will also be helpful. I worked in an extremely male-dominated organization early on in my career, and I still get emails to this day from young women that said that they looked up to me because I was one of the only women kind of managers in that firm at the time. So we do need those examples of leadership, and I think that's also an appropriate place to start.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to get a sense of, before we just go to the final couple of questions, but any additional practical tips that you'd like to offer those listening in terms of actual examples, case studies that you've seen working in different organizations. Nick?
So I think it's a strange one, but the reality is I saw when targets were applied, things change. Now, that was actually using the culture that existed within a business and the types of, I guess, worldviews that many of the leaders had in that business in a very clear way to promote the agenda. It clearly wasn't a paradox way of thinking, or even, a people and purpose way of thinking, but it works, and it worked. So I know people are sort of wary about that, but I've seen it work. And then to Alison's point, once you have the role models in place, then you'd start to get change of a more profound nature.
Well, I mean, what are your thoughts, Nick, on setting targets and quotas and measures in this kind of more paradox wave? I guess I'm kind of wondering about sometimes the unintended consequences that we have in a very target-driven organization, in which, I guess the idea and the intention and the strategy is forgotten because the target becomes the focus, and sometimes that can lead to unintended consequences. But
like in this bit, I mean, when we get to the paradox wave, the levels of leadership we will have will mean that we won't need targets. We'll just have a level of sophistication that sees diversity and inclusion as a capability, and it will be a no-brainer. But most companies aren't even in the people and purpose wave, which I think comes before that. And most companies are still in the profit wave. And I think the reality is we've got to start from where we are. And I've seen targets work to move the thing forward. And then, as I said before, once you've then got, genuinely more diverse leadership in place, you do start to move to the next wave of thinking. The next worldview starts to take hold. So I wouldn't actually take and say, oh no, targets are wrong because of all the externalities of it. Yeah, the externalities are there, but they might be right for the context you're in. And my experience over 30 years was until we put the targets in, we didn't make a step change. And until we made that step change, we didn't then move forward to the further waves of thinking.
So it's a way of moving forward, not necessarily end goal. Great. Sam?
I totally agree with Nick. I think the targets are really important, helps keep the mind focused and gives people a clear sense of direction. So I totally agree with Nick. I think for me, the starting point and the most important point is our commitment number one, which is focused around building an inclusive culture. That comes through learning. That comes through putting on really good material in an organisation. And we've been fortunate to have some really good material, whether that's the mandatory learning that we have, the allyship programme that we hold. And I think the more learning we can put, it really does help to shift the dials and shift the culture as well. So I think that for me is fundamentally really important. We've recently launched a Leading Inclusively programme for our leaders. Again, that will also help as well. So I think for me, that culture piece comes through learning and making it mandatory as well. So those are probably the two things to me.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think, having discussions with some of your team about how the role of measures and metrics actually become about inputs into learning and better quality dialogues, right? So that helps to create and shift the culture. Alison, any one practical tip from you?
Yeah, so on balance, I agree with both Sam and Nick on the targets. I've got mixed feelings about targets. They can very often encourage duking the stats, etc. But if you think about the effectiveness of targets versus, say, something like unconscious bias training, that targets the individual and targets our hardwired evolutionary biases and kind of implicitly puts the blame and responsibility on the individual and says there's nothing to consider about leadership and power here, it's all about us tackling our biases. I think that's as much of a problem as saying an individual consumer needs to solve climate change, right? So the truth is, as Nick's already described perfectly, companies do respond to targets. If this were any other business issue, the business would set targets and get it done, kind of, etc. So I agree it's a short-term thing. It doesn't get us anywhere we need to go. It might generate some backlash, but I also agree that it gets us to the point where we then start to create a different environment. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll share it in case people listening want to listen to this podcast. I listened to an amazing podcast last night about, do rats have empathy? Apparently rats do have empathy, but it depends. They looked at black rats and white rats, and you have empathy if you're a white rat if you were brought up by black rats, and not if you've never seen a black rat before. The point being that we need to bring people together to see each other's humanity. We need to stop putting people in categories. Human mind and social context and culture and group dynamics, they are plastic as hell. These can be manipulated. These can be designed. So then you are in a different environment, and human beings are incredibly driven by their social context. Just think about the Ash experiment, the Milgram experiment. So I do think we need to do something to change the social context and environment inside organizations. That might be best achieved with targets, and not go to let's target your hardwired biases and suggest that this isn't a problem with leadership or power, this is a problem with you and your prejudices. I think that is more likely to generate backlash, and in fact the evidence shows that unconscious bias training doesn't really work.
Great, thank you very much, and completely agree about how do we actually change the more broader environment. Just to super quick wrap up, because I do want to go to, I've got two questions I want to go to before we finish today. I'd love to hear from each of you, rapid fire. What gives you cause for concern? What gives you hope? And one piece of advice. So, we've done the one piece of advice. So just what gives you cause for concern and what gives you hope? Sam.
So I wouldn't say it's more of a concern, but actually just making sure we're not complacent. I think we've got good momentum on the commitments and the targets that we've set ourselves. I think we are building that culture we want to see. So I think for me, the key thing is making sure that we continue to build that good momentum and we don't be complacent. I think what gives me hope is when we look at our report we published yesterday, our 1 year on, and seeing the progress we're making against the 10 commitments. We still have more work to do, we know, but the fact that actually we are sharing our progress, so that for me gives me hope.
Fantastic. Nick?
I used to describe my purpose in life as bringing creativity from conflict. And I'm so concerned at the moment about the conflict in the world. Just what's going on in the USA with the debt ceiling. In 11 days' time, the US government might well default on its debt, bringing the financial systems to its knees. We've got a climate emergency happening that has gone beyond tipping point. We're in a position, God bless us, with the gas supplies now in most of the world where we actually might not be able to heat and the lights might go off. And in the UK, we've just compounded our problems by hitting ourselves on the head with Brexit. So we're in a situation now, which I have to say in my lifetime is the most depressing outlook I've ever seen. But creativity from conflict, this is our opportunity to come together. This is our opportunity to solve these problems, actually jumping to the new paradigm. And the thing that gives me hope is you don't get to the new paradigm without crisis. So that's the paradox of this crisis. I'm really scared about the crisis, but the paradox is I'm also hopeful it will give birth to the new paradigm.
Fantastic. Alison, can you build on that?
That is hard to beat. And I was also going to talk about, I mean, what keeps me up at night, what gives me concern. I mean, just go anywhere. There's a giant list of problems. In addition to what Nick said, I mean, we can no longer agree on what is reality. John Haidt, who I work with, says it's like the Tower of Babel. We've lost this kind of shared view of reality. And I think it's not going to be very easy to tackle climate change or polarization or anything else if we can't even agree on that. As Nick was talking, I was thinking I used to do a lot of futures and scenario planning work, and I'm thinking about all these conversations we had when we were thinking about 2030 and 40 and 50, and the only way we could see to get where we needed to go was via some giant crisis in the early 2020s. So I do think that's right. I do think we are in a kind of transformational time, and I just hope it turns out well for all our sake. So I suppose I would say that in general, whether it's inclusion, whether it's sustainability, we're at the beginning of this conversation. We're not at the end of this conversation. I think the next decade is going to be critical. The thing that gives me hope that I've mentioned already is just being in the classroom. I teach a mandatory MBA course, so I get everybody coming through Stern School of Business at MBA and undergrad level. These are people studying business. They're not studying sustainability. They're not studying human rights. These are business people. And I see such dramatic changes in their values and what they expect and how they hope to lead and how they think about these issues that I'm excited to see how our organizations change when these people are in charge. A lot of pressure on them to solve all our problems. But I see I think we're in the middle of a giant moral revolution. And I think, I hope that we will see incredible transformations, not just to working life, but to life in general during our lifetime.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm just going to open up to questions now. I'm going to call on, I hope I pronounced this correctly now, Yangbo Du. Yangbo, would you like to unmute and ask the question?
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Not very well. If you could speak up. There you go.
Yep, how about now? Better?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, great. So just had some two questions, and some of this was drawn from that podcast recently with the House on Breaking Fever about polarization. So from what I could see is that you have, especially given the context of the US, you have three different poles of political orientation. You have the progressive, libertarian, conservative, and each of them, they're not so much as distinct in substance as they are in terms of language and how to describe the same problems, same challenges, and same themes. So how might we adopt some form of language that avoid alienating those who could be otherwise allies to this. And secondly, the point is, this is from much of what I've been following in the ESG, SDG, impact finance space, is de-risking the perception of DEI isn't, I mean, it's probably not an exact translation, but you can consider that given so much of this shift, this attempt to shift away from trying to beat the market or maximize returns at all costs, you're pushing against a structure that rewards all of that, and anything deviating from that is considered career risk. So there may be similarities on the diversity, equity, inclusion, justice front, and then how might then we best de-risk that so we can actually weave that into the kernel, into the core of these organizations, instead of treating this as just an add-on, a box ticking or virtue signaling exercise, but rather this is the core of how we build organizations and institutions.
Alison, I'm going to draw on you for this one, as I know you've been discussing this quite openly on LinkedIn recently.
Which bit would you like me to tackle? Sorry, that was complicated.
Yeah, I think, well, there was a question around language, and then there was around this kind of more broader structure, ESG, de-risking it.
Yeah, so big topics, and I know we don't have very long. On language, I think that a lot of what drives polarization and a lot of what drives internal conflict is sort of posturing in front of your group. So I think companies have to work very hard not to replicate the kind of dynamics that we see on Twitter. I had a student in my class whose organization had a sort of virtual town hall around diversity and inclusion for very, very good, well-intentioned reasons. During this DEI town hall, they had anonymous chat in the comments, and then what they found was some employees started putting racist anonymous comments in the chat, and it really upset other employees. And so with the best intentions, the company had basically recreated Twitter in the Zoom chat. Compare that, and then we had kind of Basecamp saying we can't talk about politics at work. Apple's just banned talking about pay equity at work. So that doesn't work either, because people kind of go to the general public. There was another firm that said you can post polarized political content on the internal Slack channel, but you also need to post a video of yourself explaining why you posted it. And so that, I think, kind of takes the temperature down. It forces a more collaborative environment. It is a very, very smart way to kind of approach that. I think there's a lot more to be said about the kind of language that we use about around ESG and DEI. I personally think that the exclusive framing, or we seem to be moving towards framing that we equate climate with social justice. I understand why. I'm not saying that that's wrong. But the problem is that social justice is a very, very, very polarized issue. So what you're effectively doing as a progressive with that framing is leaving no avenue for a conservative or a Republican to believe in climate change. So that, I think, is an absolutely giant self-sabotaging mistake. And I see similar behavior from responsible business practitioners all the time. Very fundamentalist, very judgmental, seems very unrealistic. So I also think we need to get practical. We need to meet businesses where they are, and we need to think in a much more strategic way about all these issues. More to say, but I know we're over time. I'm sorry.
That's great. We are over time. So, but thank you very much. And I guess some key points there that I heard from you were about taking down the temperature of conversations, ensuring there's accountability for what people are actually saying, and just being really mindful that of good, well-intentioned stuff, but can be self-sabotaging, and the judgmental aspect of kind of the things that we can sometimes say, which I am guilty of as much as anyone else. So I just want to thank everyone for joining. I was hoping we'd have a little bit more time for some questions, but it's been a fascinating conversation. And I want to thank the panelists in particular, Nick, Samuel, and Alison, and also for my colleagues working behind the scenes, Amelia and Sula as well, for helping me pull this session together. So thank you all, and the recording will be sent shortly. All the best. Bye.